Good day and welcome to the CDI Talks. Today my guest is Stanislav Secrieru, a Senior Analyst at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, an institution that analyzes foreign, security and defense policy issues. Stanislav Secrieru joined the Institute in September 2018 to cover Russia and the EU's eastern neighborhood. His research interests focus on EU-Russia relations, Russia's foreign and security policy in the post-Soviet region, protracted conflicts and the EU's relations with the Eastern Partnership states. We caught up with Stanislav last month, and here is our conversation. I hope you will find it important and useful. If it is the case, do like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are more videos like this to come. Stanislav, yesterday the European Parliament voted in favor of a report on the relations between the EU and Russia, and I must say that this report was quite harsh. The fighting tone was quite evident. If we are talking about Eastern Partnership countries, these countries had experienced Russian political warfare long before Putin's regime increasingly started its active measures against the EU. So what types of political warfare could you highlight when we're talking about this political warfare against such countries as Moldova, Georgia and Ukraine? If you could start with Moldova, for example.
Look, I think, provide the mix, melange of cases which will have Georgia, Ukraine and Moldova. And I think it will help audience to understand how Russian political warfare evolved during the 90s. I think first interesting case in the Russian arsenal of political warfare was instrumentalization of national minorities. Instrumentalization in order to provoke, inflame, sustain territorial conflicts. And this is the case, for instance, of Abkhazia in 1992, 1993. The case of Abkhazia was pretty dramatic for Georgia, because they've been defeated there with the help of support of Russian military who fought on the side of Abkhazia. And as a result of ceasefire, they had to concede that they lost de facto control of Abkhazia. But more to that, they accepted creation of new military bases on the territory of Georgia. They acceded to Commonwealth of Independent States. They signed the Treaty for Collective Security. And they accepted Russian veto power to name ministers of defense, interior and security. It's a lot. And it shows you what were the objectives of Russian political warfare in the region. First was to keep the dependencies of these three states at least. Force them to join Russian-led organizations. And third, to corrode the state building. And this is the very good case which shows how Russia, at least in the early 90s, achieved these objectives. But then, when we talk about national minorities, there were in Russian arsenal non-violent instrumentalization of this. And this is the case of Crimea. Now we can read in the memoirs that Russian officials were raising the issue of Crimea from 1992. Many of them considered to be liberals. In case of Crimea, Russia didn't go for a violent conflict. It preferred to use it in the complex game in order to secure the basing rights, to divide the fleet, and in exchange recognize the territorial integrity and appertenance of Crimea to Ukraine. And this game was played from 1992 to 1997. This big package signed at that time. Crimea was a part of this, and national minorities was part of this complex political game. Another non-violent case of instrumentalization of national minorities is Gagauzia, Moldova. But I'm going a bit further than the 90s, but just to show that one of the favorite instruments of Russian political warfare is referendums. For instance, in 2014, Russia helped organize illegal referendum in Gagauzia, where locals were asked to express their opinions on the foreign policy direction, whether they prefer Eurasian Economic Union or Customs Union and European integration. In that time, the scope, it's interesting that the referendum was sponsored by the Russian businessmen of Moldovan origin. The scope of referendum was to put pressure on Moldovan government, who was ready to sign association agreement. The signal was, if you move into this direction, you probably might lose control of other parts of your country. Yeah. So this is ethnic minorities. But then there is another case of political subversion, when a Russian political warfare was aiming to replace governments or presidents, and again, in violent or non-violent way. And if I would think about violent way, I would think about President Shevardnadze. After he signed all these painful accords with Russia, under which Georgia lost space for political and military maneuver, obviously, naturally, after stabilizing situation, he was trying to gain the autonomy in relationship with Russia. So he sacked the ministers imposed by Russia, security, defense. I think Georgia didn't ratify the collective security treaty. And during these, activities, there were 3 assassination attempts against Shevardnadze. Yes, one can say that it was just a coincidence, between the assassination attempts and his moves to gain more freedom.
We still don't know who was behind those
Exactly.
attempts.
The thing is that all people who were suspected, who were behind, found the refuge in Russian Federation. And being asked to be extradited, they have not been extradited back to Georgia. I agree that we don't have solid proofs.
Do we know their citizenship?
They were Russian. Some of them were Russian citizens. But then there is a non-violent case when Russia tried to replace the government, or at least, Russia never is the leading actor. Sometimes it plays with local forces. And this was the case of Moldovan government in 1999. It was a short-lived, pretty reformist government. And then the local coalition tried to gather the votes in order to vote it down. And Russia provided a helping hand because they reduced the gas deliveries by 40%. And it was early November. And 12 days later, the government is voted down. And one of the reasons which circulated at that time in the political space was because this government didn't manage to prepare country for the heating season. And it was a very, very useful kind of coincidence for Moldovan politicians who were trying to get rid of this government. Then there is, of course, economic coercion, as a part of political warfare. Because in many cases, for Russia, economics is about politics. They are ready to sacrifice even financial gains in order to achieve geopolitical advantages. And I think we paid too much attention to what Russia was doing in 2000s, but we forget that there is a long track record of gas supplies cuts, price hikes, restrictions for access to the Russian market. I think among the first cases of gas cuts to Ukraine was somewhere in 1993.
Oh, really?
Yes. And it lasted only one day because Ukrainian authorities at that time threatened to cancel the transit of the gas to Europe. It shows you how important, even today for Ukraine, to have this transit of Russian gas to Europe. And I think later we have seen pretty painful for Georgia and Moldova economic warfare on the side of Russian Federation. First, when Moldova refused to sign the Cossack Memorandum, sort of a dysfunctional solution for the Transnistrian conflict. And then it was much harsher in case of Georgia because in addition to restricting or banning mineral water and wine, there was a blockade of air transportation, they introduced visas for Georgians, and there were expulsions of Georgians, for which Russian Federation was sentenced in the European Court of Human Rights recently.
For something that was in the 90s?
It was 2006.
2006.
It was 2006, so I think what is important to see is that, yes, in the 90s, many things were happening in terms of political warfare. What happened in 2000s, and especially 2010s, it's significant escalation. In addition, the geographical expansion of Russian political warfare. And then I think the last point, it's information, information space. Russian TV was pretty popular in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. First, it's the fact that the local producers were pretty weak of local content. There was not that much local attractive content. And at the same time, Russian channels were pretty competitive in terms of generating very attractive products. I remember how people were gathering every Friday to watch Polye Chudes, the Field of Miracles. And then on Sundays to watch the media killer Sergei Dorenko destroying Mr. Lushkov and at that time Primakov running for parliamentary elections. And this created the sensation among many people living in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova that they knew much more what is happening in Russia than what was happening in their proper country, especially among those who were Russian speakers. And second thing, when they saw something about their own countries, the images and presentation was not that good, about what was happening in Transnistria, for instance, or in Ukraine, or in Georgia. So all these instruments which I mentioned, ethnic minorities, economic coercion, political sabotage, was always accompanied by this information coverage, which was very negative often. And we've seen it later in 2000s and especially 2010, how it migrated into the digital space and became much more organized.
Let's go back a little bit to what you said. You said that even Russian liberals or so-called liberals would raise the question of Crimea in the 90s. And you talked about this instrumentalization of national minorities. At the same time, during the 90s, there was this feeling, at least among some experts, that Russia was trying to build a democracy. And it was helped by the Western community, by the US, by European countries. At the same time, why do you think that Russia was still doing these totally undemocratic, anti-liberal things, at the same time pretending to be building a democracy, a liberal democracy?
I think the original point is that when Russia was signing Belavezhye-Push Accords, they were thinking that it was not the end of the Soviet Union. It was legally end of the Soviet Union. But I think, and as well reading memoirs of Russian officials at that time, the hope was that in time we will regain influence in the region. These countries will come back to us, not as a old form of a state, Soviet Union, on a different basis, but anyway we will come back to us. And I think at that time there was a combination, there was not such a good hierarchical subordination that you have a vertical of power, orders from Kremlin going to the chain of command, in the field. There were competing centers of power in the Russian Federation. If you look at the conflicts, you can see that some members of the Supreme Soviet at that time, who were in the opposition to President Yeltsin, were supporting much more conflicts, allocating resources, traveling there. It's not to say that Russian state was not interested in these conflicts, but at that time there was not such a perfect division. I remember that people from Transnistria with fighting skills were involved in the 1993 crisis in Moscow, which didn't make them very popular among the supporters of President Yeltsin at that time. So I think first there was a hope that despite the temporary weakness, Russia, it was not for the first time when Russian state experienced weakness. And this is sort of in the DNA of Russian elites. We experienced weaknesses, but every time we managed to come back. And I think this was the belief that yes, we terminate Soviet Union, but it's not the end of the road. We will combine these economic tools, Probably we will become more attractive because we will conduct some reforms. Probably we will be a model for others to conduct reforms. And second element, we will develop a very close relationship with Europe and United States. Yeah? So basically we will be a very civilized great power. And why not to be under our umbrella? Yeah? And for you it will be kind of access to Europe via Russia, via European Russia. Yeah.
Do you think that by creating these territorial problems in Moldova, in Georgia, do you think that the idea of by doing this, by blocking access to NATO, was in the minds of those people? Because that it's very difficult to join NATO if you have these territorial problems.
I think Russian political warfare had different objectives in the 90s and then different objectives in 2000s. I think in the 90s nobody thought about NATO and EU. Even these local governments, they were only initiating first steps, negotiating first treaties with European Union, the type of treaties which were offered to Russia as well. I think it's in 2000s that this dimension to create obstacles on the road towards EU, be it signing association agreements and DCFTAs, be it receiving membership action plans, were integrated as a tool to prevent through the political warfare. And in 2008 and later in 2014, unfortunately, in order to achieve the objectives, Russia went much beyond political warfare. Yeah, it's because political warfare failed. And we have seen how it went hand in hand, and elements of political warfare and conventional warfare. Yeah, and after suspension of hostilities, we have seen a continuation of political warfare. Yeah, and it was pretty tough. And for Georgia and for Ukraine and for Moldova, they paid a pretty high price.
For Moldova, I think it was the beginning of the 90s already when territories were alienated from Moldova, Transnistria, and then Abkhazia, South Ossetia. The same for Georgia. So it's the 90s, basically the beginning of the 90s. Why Ukraine, was basically kept untouched for so much time? I can offer an explanation, of course, that in the beginning of the 90s, Ukraine still had nuclear weapons. That can be one explanation why nothing really happened. But then, the Orange Revolution, and even during the President Leonid Kuchma's times, there were some frictions between Russia and Ukraine. But still, would you say that political warfare was successful until 2014? Because I know after the Orange Revolution, after pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko became president of Ukraine in 2005, after these mass protests, why would they not make a move even then?
I have a couple of assumptions why it didn't happen in Ukraine. And I always compare to the cases of Georgia and Moldova. First, you've mentioned nuclear. And on the one hand, obviously Russia was interested to evacuate nuclear weapons from Ukraine. But it was not only Russia who was interested. United States as well.
Absolutely.
And they worked in tandem. And for Ukraine was a choice. Either you give up on nuclear weapons or you are sort of isolated in the international community. So for Ukraine it was not an option to keep weapons. Yeah? In addition to the fact that operationally Ukraine never could use them. So nuclear factor was important restraining factor, I think. Second, I think Ukrainian leadership played a much smarter game. I think Ukrainian leadership was less assertive towards national minorities. There was no nationalization of Ukrainian public space. There was no talk about Ukrainian language that much, yeah? While if you look at the Moldovan and Georgian case, there was a very powerful sentiment of national emancipation, yeah, which sort of generated some pushback as well, which Russia speculated as well, and sometimes inflated. This is my second assumption. And reading some memoirs of Moldovan officials, and they are kind of presenting the lessons learned in the 30 years, you can see that there is opinion that we could play, they say, a much smarter game. We played it pretty brutally,
This is a very good point, but at the same time, some experts would say that the failure, they would use the word failure, of Ukraine to create a national project, Ukraine-centric national project, actually led eventually to the problems of state building, because a national project goes hand in hand with creating a state and reform state institutions, economic reforms. So now we are talking. So would you say that was a vulnerability of Ukraine, that they did not pursue this national project, or it was a smart decision, but in the end we can say that they failed anyway?
I think any decision you take has its weak points and strong points. Yeah, I think what counted in case of Ukraine, that it was unsuccessful and Russia managed to build on these weaknesses, were delayed economic reforms. I think was too much of politics and too less of policies. I think there was a lack of political will and high-level corruption, which was linked to Moscow. Yeah, and I think this plus lack of energy diversification and trade diversification. So somehow I think in Kyiv assumed that it will be forever, that you can play this game forever. I think Ukraine could play this game while preparing to diversify and prepare alternatives. Then Ukraine would have a much better chances to sustain Russian political warfare in 2010. But unfortunately it didn't happen. And I think Russia speculated as well Moldovan and Georgian weaknesses. Yeah, for instance,
this is something that I would like to ask you. What weaknesses Russia used in Moldova and Georgia that made this political warfare more beneficial and more successful for Russia?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, sometimes lack or misguided policies towards minorities. Yeah. Second thing. And in both in Georgia and Moldova, there was a pretty weak mass media. Mm-hmm. So locals were anchored much more into the Russian media space than in the local media space. I think third element, energy dependence. Russia speculated it. In 2006 in Georgia, in the midst of cold season, simultaneously exploded on the Russian territory gas pipeline, which was pumping gas to Georgia, and electrical lines, which were supplying electricity. 2006, simultaneously, almost. Yeah. Again, we don't have proofs that it was done intentionally. But at the same time, Russia was asking for a much, much higher price for gas from Georgia. The same was in case of Moldova. There was at least one case when there was complete suspension of gas deliveries, when people had to cook in the gardens or in front of the blocks of apartments. Obviously, when someone can do this, government has a very narrow space for maneuvering. And I think in both cases, what helped Russia is the availability of entrepreneurs of violence, former veterans of Afghan wars, or former veterans of other conflicts, who had skills to fight and sometimes went to fight on the Russian side. it's interesting that in case of Transnistria, Russia used the OMON, which repressed and was involved in violent repressed in Riga. Yeah. So they basically were ordered to go to Russia, but from Russia they went to Transnistria. Not all of them, but some of them. Among them was famous Mr. Antyufev, who created the security service of Transnistrian Separatist Republic, whose later skills were in demand to set up separatist structures in eastern Ukraine as well.
But for a very short time, actually.
Exactly. Yeah. But anyway, his skills were in demand at that time. This is about entrepreneurs of violence whom Russia knew how to use and recruit. And I think last element I've mentioned in the case of Ukraine, but it's available for Moldova and Georgia. It's very fragile institutions. And it was perfect time actually for Russian political warfare, because these states just regained the independence. Moldova didn't have an army in 1992. In the early 1992, there was no army. The major war actions were conducted by police. Yeah? So basically, it was a militarization of police, what we have seen in Moldova's case, in order to fend off Russian attacks.
The Russian army was not that strong either, I think, in those times.
14 army was pretty strong.
Really?
Yeah. 14 army was pretty strong.
The First Chechen War also showed that the weaknesses of the Russian army.
Yes, but I think militarily, Moldovan side was weaker than the Chechen paramilitary units during the First Chechen War. And I think what happened in Georgia, there were warlords, fighting on the side of Georgian government, whom Georgian government have problem to control. Yeah. And it later spilled over into the organized crime and problems with monopolization of violence by the state. These states, at least in case of Georgia, in the initial stage were pretty weak because they were not able to control or monopolize violence. And then I think in both cases, it's not only valid for Ukraine, but Georgia and Moldova, high-level corruption. Some people in political leads, they had assets in Moscow. Yeah, they have businesses, they had apartments, they had a network. They were part of network. Yeah. And they didn't behave in very patriotic way. They were not thinking about state building. Probably they were thinking about filling their pockets and preserving power.
Now is the time to ask you also about the lessons for the EU from this political warfare of the Kremlin in Eastern Partnership. But before I ask you this, you're talking about the lack of energy diversification in Ukraine, for example. That was a weakness. But now we see that Germany welcomed the Nord Stream 2, which does not really lead to diversification of gas supplies to the EU, and also creates dependence. Some dependence of the EU on Russia, and it's building a weakness. But my question is general. What lessons do you think the EU learned from this political warfare against Eastern Partnership countries?
I think I cannot be very blunt in terms of what did EU learn. I hope that lessons were learned, or maybe some lessons to be learned, But I think looking at what happened to these three countries and Russian political warfare there during the last 2 or 3 decades, I think first thing is that Russian political warfare is a long-term challenge. Yeah? There is a tradition, there is experience on the Russian side, and when I think they conduct assessment, it's considered partially successful. Yeah? You've mentioned the obstacles to join NATO, for instance, through these conflicts. Then they paid a high price, populations as well. Then I think the lesson for you that I think it's probably a long-term challenge. Yeah, it's not going to disappear. Second lesson is what happens in the East doesn't stay in the East. Yeah? In many respects. For instance, Russian strategic hostile communication in these various countries was targeting EU as well, not only local governments. Yeah. In another way, why it doesn't stay in the East is because Russia tested and learned some tactics and gained some experiences, and later, after learning the lessons, conducted the total revamp of certain operations or tools. For instance, Russia rebranded RT after the war with Georgia in 2008.
It was Russia Today.
It was Russia Today before. But after the war, they made the assessment and they believe they were not very successful in terms of information warfare. What they did, they rebranded and they pumped much more money, and after that RT expanded the geographic focus. Yeah? It was after a war in Georgia, and it was the lesson learned by Russia Federation. Why, again, I say that it doesn't stay in the East? Because some of the tools used against these countries had an impact on EU as such as well. Yeah? Gas cut off against Ukraine created energy problems in European Union. I would say that combination of high-level corruption and money laundering as well, some proceeds ended up in European Union. Yeah. So there are effects of what is happening there for EU directly or indirectly. And I think the lesson for you, or how to turn it into action, is first to study carefully Russian political warfare in these three countries. Yeah? And second, to stay much closer engaged with these countries and help them to sustain and defend against this kind of hostile tactics. Third lesson is about vulnerabilities. I think the lesson for you is learn your vulnerabilities and try to close the gaps. Yeah? And I think we are seeing things moving in this direction. For instance, there is a project to set up anti-money laundering agency within EU. Yeah? We have seen a democracy action plan. We have seen on EU level attempts to pool resources to beef up cyber security. Obviously, you have mentioned there is a work to be done in terms of creating proper energy market. And one pillar of this energy market, not only interconnections, but also diversification. Yeah. In addition to the slowly building up on the green energy, which probably will make us in time less dependent on the oil and gas and coal imported sometimes from external partners. And the last lesson, which I think is important for you, when I look at these countries, especially in the 90s, they were quite often alone. They didn't get much support. Later they got from EU, yeah, in 2000s, 2010. But in the 90s, they were pretty much on their own. Yeah? And I think what is important for EU to realize how important the fact that these countries can pool resources, stay together, and fend off pretty hostile actions, which are coming not only from Russia, yeah, but from other actors as well. I remember my talk with one diplomat from EU member state, who, among the lessons for his diplomatic service during the crisis in bilateral relationship with Russia, was super important that he had behind the rest of 27 member states at that time, with UK inside. Yeah. When you are not a big player, it's important when you have solidarity of other members, and when you can pool resources together in order to address some security threats for your country. So I think this sort of solidarity, alliance, and how important to stay together, it's one of the lessons important for you. And not only in relationship with Russia, but with other actors as well.
You mentioned the rebranding of Russia Today into RT after the war against Georgia in 2008. It's interesting to note that there was another rebranding of The Voice of Russia. Mm-hmm. There was a radio station, but also websites in different languages, The Voice of Russia, and around the time of the conflict with Ukraine, that rebranded it into Sputnik. That was another development in the media space. And my question would be here also about the media. After the start of the war against Ukraine, so 2014, there were many discussions in the EU in different states, especially in the Baltic states, about creation of the Russian language media in the EU in order to sort of end the monopoly of the Russian state on the major Russian language channels. So do you think that maybe now, I think some Baltic states would have those media channels, but what about the media in general? I'm not talking about the Baltic states and not only about the Russian language media, but if you look at the media space of countries of Central Eastern Europe, before they joined the EU, there was support for independent media. Because the thinking was that, well, those countries are developing, they are preparing to get to become members of the European Union, so their media needs support. When they joined, this support was cut off. The understanding was, well, they joined the club, now they are totally okay, they're totally normal, they don't need support for the independent media. But as we see what's happening in Hungary, what's happening in Romania, we see that actually independent media needs support. Otherwise, different business groups which are not necessarily supportive of liberal democracy are taking over and turning this media, independent media, into totally controlled media that promotes the narratives and messages of the not very democratic, not very liberal forces. So isn't that, what about this lesson? Do you feel or do you see any developments in this area on the part of the EU?
Look, I'm not expert on media as such, especially on media in Central Europe. What I did and what I covered throughout the years is how media evolved in those three Eastern Partnership countries, And obviously, we can extract several lessons from what happened there. In Ukraine, obviously, it's a dominance of oligarchs, of a media market. It's really a bad practice, and it's a lesson for EU. Second thing is that you need to develop a really attractive local content. It has to be customized to the local audience. You cannot produce a content somewhere, in one country and then expect that you can easily export and it become a very successful product, Georgia or Ukraine or Moldova. And I think from your perspective, it's really important to sustain these independent channels which are producing local content. I know that it was a couple of projects through which you supported new TV channels, for instance, in Moldova. When at that time Moldovan leadership was trying to clean up the information space. But in Ukraine, the advantage was that oligarchs and the TVs were competing between themselves. In Moldova, at that time, Vlad Plahotniuc tried to eliminate alternative TV channels and to monopolize completely the market. And I think it's an important lesson for you, I think you learned, is when you see it in the Eastern neighborhood, to step in and to defend independent mass media in order to provide to alternative political forces a voice and to give them opportunity to reach out to citizens. And by the way, this support you provided to independent TV channels was really important. It contributed to the change of power which unfolded in 2 or 3 years in Moldova. It was really important. And when we see now the democratic backsliding and re-authoritarian practices in Georgia, we again see that among the preferential targets of government are journalists and independent TV channels. And I think the third lesson, which is really important, is that, it's not enough to develop local content in the local languages, national languages, but also it's important to have content in the Russian language as well, so that Russia doesn't monopolize the narratives in these countries. And I think we have seen, or at least I have seen, a couple of solid Russian-speaking mass media which are providing a pretty good coverage of what is happening in country, but also outside. What happened, interestingly, in case of Moldova, is that being sandwiched between two big countries, Romania and Ukraine, obviously a lot of news are imported and they enter into the public space. And when war happened in Ukraine and more dramatic news were coming, Moldovans were learning about what is happening there and what kind of strategies Russia uses, So I think in some cases it helped for people to realize who at that time were not pretty sure, but the real face of Russian policies, in the post-Soviet or Eastern Partnership states, to say it better. I think media will remain a very sensitive topic, and I think as far as it concerns those three Eastern Partnership states, there were things have been done by EU, but I think EU has to persist and to stay engaged and to defend journalists and to help independent mass media, including Russian-speaking as well.
You described lessons learned from Russia's political warfare in Eastern Partnership, but where do you still probably see some soft spots or lessons that are not learned by the EU? Where do you think the EU could do better looking at this experience of political warfare in Eastern Partnership?
I have seen that before there was a thinking that we do good policies, we do good things in Eastern neighborhood, and we don't need a lot to talk about it. People will see that we are good guys. And I think after several years of pretty nasty communication from Russian side, I think there was a realization that EU needs to, in a positive way, to escalate its communication. I've watched it during the COVID pandemic, and I really have seen positive changes. The way it communicates via Twitter, all the deliveries, photo opportunities, everything. So there is a learning. But I think there is a way to grow and to invest even more in communication, reaching out to skeptical constituencies in these countries. Not necessarily trying to convince them, but just communicating to them. There is a skeptical community of clerics. Church was always a bit conservative and was not very happy about some of initiatives linked to European integration. So I think to reach out to these skeptical communities is one way to go. I think another push where I can see is needed is to reform the advertisement market, because it's interlinked with the media market. We have seen some big players monopolizing this market, and then they can dictate what happens on the media market as well. I think we have seen very bad cases of money laundering, which created troubles for some European banks. And I think there is a way to think how to first to introduce more conditionalities for Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova to fight money laundering, but as well to find ways to cooperate with these countries to prevent the proceeds ending up in the banking systems of European Union. And I think overall, EU can do much more. It does, but EU can do much more in terms of overall security. Not necessarily conventional, but as well non-conventional security. And we are ahead of a summit of Eastern Partnership in December. Maybe some important decisions will be discussed there. But I even have seen in the news the discussions in the EU about a mission which will be helping to educate Ukrainian military. Yeah? So I see very weak signals that we are slowly moving in this direction, step by step, incrementally. And I have seen the speech of the President of European Commission yesterday, and again security was mentioned. And it's interesting that President linked the security to the capacity of EU to do much more in the immediate neighborhood, to stabilize neighborhood. Cannot agree more. I think the next field is to do much more in terms of security, be it cyber, helping with economic diversification, different aspects, which in the end will help EU to reach out to diverse actors in these countries, to build bridges, but at the same time to help these societies to become more resilient. Because, as I said, I think Russian political warfare is to stay here.
My final question would be: I know that you not so long ago published a book on cybersecurity, cyber warfare, together with Nicu Popescu. It was a collected volume of different articles. Do you think that in the cyber domain, the EU is developing, is building resilience? Is it stagnating?
Yeah, I have seen, in case of Ukraine, I have seen some movements to help Ukraine. First, to secure a digital infrastructure during elections, for instance. I have seen that the EU launched the cyber dialogue. EU usually has these most important partners as cyber dialogues as well. So I have seen that it recently was launched with Ukraine too. What I would probably suggest is to expand it to Georgia and Ukraine. I think more steps can be done, even if I think I have seen that there are plans to beef up the local teams which are reacting to cyber incidents, so that they can in real time to address immediate effects of a cyber attack. Second, I think in addition to that, there is a way to exchange information on cyber attacks, to understand how actors who've been on the attacking side, what kind of instruments, what type of instruments, how their strategies and tactics, to share information. And why not? Third is to do some exercises, cyber exercises, Why not? I think, at least in case of Ukraine, it's a sort of a cyber power, because it has a pretty sizable cyber force, IT experts. It's known in Europe. I think Ukraine was, in many instances, the target of fundamental attacks against the infrastructure, with huge impact not only for Ukraine but also for Europe and the United States. I think these three countries gain some expertise, and I think it's not only interest of EU to help them secure these countries, but as well to learn from these countries. So I rather see it as a mutual exercise, in which each side learns, and it's sort of win-win, but not that some gains and another one just offers. And I think because our lives are moving more and more into the online space, cybersecurity will become even more important.
Thank you very much for these conversations, Stanislav.
Thank you.